I'm going to turn the time over to Julie Shepard, who is a clinical outreach specialist at OCD Anxiety Centers. She's going to tell us a little bit about what Kate Rogers does.
Thanks so much, Joseph. I appreciate it. So I'm always excited to introduce Dr. Kate Rogers. Kate is our Director of Research and Outcomes at OCD Anxiety Centers. And Kate is a licensed clinical psychologist that's specializing in anxiety disorders and OCD. And she's been with OCD Anxiety Center since 2016. Kate plays a very important role in ensuring our treatment remains evidence-based and informed by the latest research. One of the things that we really appreciate about Kate is how willing she always is to share her knowledge and expertise in settings like these. She's incredibly generous with her time and always happy to help educate or answer questions and support other professionals in the work that they're doing. So we're very great to have her as a resource and especially great to have her here with us today. So with that being said, I will turn the time over to Kate. So welcome, Kate, Dr. Kate Rogers.
Thank you, Julie. Julie says such nice things about me. I am so excited to be here. I love doing these sorts of presentations. Just like Julie said, I get really enthusiastic about them. So I'll try my best to rein myself in. Um, do me a favor, anyone that's willing, turn your camera on. I always say I get tired of staring at my own face and hearing my own voice, and the more interactive we can make things, the better it is for everyone. So if you're willing to turn your camera on, turn it on. Okay, we are going to jump in. I'm not sure how many of you were here the last time I presented. I talked a lot about the idea of a false alarm and really breaking down and understanding how anxiety disorders, and OCD and related disorders really work at the core. And so today we're going to zoom in on a more specific topic. And we're going to talk about the difference between OCD and generalized anxiety disorder, two diagnoses that come up more than you might think and can be really tricky. So as we go through, I'll pause where I can for questions. I definitely will admit that I can't pay attention to the chat while I'm going. So if Joseph or Summer will help me out when there's something juicy in the chat, just raise your hand or wave around or something. Okay. So today, like I said, we're going to zoom in more. So I want everybody to walk away today with a really clear understanding of the nature of obsessive-compulsive disorder and really specifically some hallmark features to look for. We're going to do the same thing for generalized anxiety disorder and really be able to identify those hallmark features. When we are screening for these things, what is it that we're looking for that's going to make this really jump out at us? And I want you to walk away feeling way more confident in terms of differential diagnosis, looking between OCD and generalized anxiety disorder. How can we tell the difference? What are some key differences we're looking for? So my hope is you all walk away with your head held high, feeling really fabulous about these three things. I mentioned that I have been here before and I did a whole big presentation on this. So we're going to do a super, super quick refresher. I think understanding obsessive compulsive disorder and understanding generalized anxiety disorder means you have to understand how anxiety works at the core. So when we at OCD Anxiety Centers talk about OCD and anxiety disorders, we talk about it through the lens of a false alarm. When we understand our anxiety as an alarm system, it really breaks it down so clearly. So, quick review. Our anxiety works like an alarm. When we perceive that something is dangerous, our brain perceives a threat, the alarm goes off. When the alarm goes off, our sympathetic nervous system clicks on and dumps delightful chemicals into our body like adrenaline and cortisol. And this is what causes us to essentially feel the feels: anxiety, distress. When we feel that, our emotions typically tell us to do something. They're very bossy. And that's where we feel this urge bubbling up to do something to try to neutralize the threat our brain says is there. And that is what we call neutralizing behaviors. Any behavior that tries to neutralize that perceived threat. And super important to keep in mind, every single time we engage in a neutralizing behavior, we learn that threat must be dangerous. That threat must be real. We confirm the threat, and that is what tightens this alarm. We have learned, yup, this thing sure is dangerous. When I present this to people initially, I often talk about something that everyone could understand. You don't need an anxiety disorder. You don't need OCD to understand your alarm system. You all have an anxiety alarm. Feel super confident saying that because you've all made it this far into adulthood. So we can typically credit that to our anxiety alarm in many ways. Because imagine for a moment, you're walking down the street, and all of a sudden, for no good reason at all, out jumps a grizzly bear. And when there's a grizzly bear just a few feet in front of you, chances are your brain will perceive a threat. It says, this bear is going to eat your face. Sympathetic nervous system turns on, dumps the chemicals. We feel the feels. There's a grizzly bear that's going to eat your face. And then I'm going to ask you, do we have a chat here? Everybody in your little chat window here. Be honest with yourself for just a moment. What would you do? Type into the chat window, what would you do when faced with a grizzly bear? We got a lot of great classics. Run, freeze, pretend to die. Oh, somebody's carrying bear spray. They're very, very prepared. All of these behaviors, pee my pants, maybe not that one. All of these behaviors that are intentional are considered neutralizing behaviors because even though some of these probably aren't going to work out super well for you, the intention behind all of them is to try to neutralize the perceived threat of the bear eating your face. These are neutralizing behaviors. The purpose of these behaviors is not to make you feel better. A lot of these things aren't going to make you feel better. They're not soothing. The purpose of these behaviors is to try to neutralize the threat of the bear eating your face. And our anxiety system is designed in a really cool way that when we engage in a neutralizing behavior, we learn the threat is real, the thing is dangerous, and it tightens the alarm. A tighter alarm is going to go off more easily. And that's great because this bear is going to eat your face, and bears are dangerous. So as we jump into looking at OCD and generalized anxiety disorder today, I need you to remember that anxiety is not the enemy. Our anxiety system, our anxiety alarm is a great friend of ours because bears exist in the world. And the way anxiety works is it helps us learn about what is safe and what is dangerous. And when someone has OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, what's happening at the core of that diagnosis is a busted alarm. This wonderful anxiety alarm responsible for the survival of the species is going off when it doesn't need to. It has become a false alarm. So now, instead of going off for the grizzly bear, it's going to go off exactly the same for the teddy bear, for a misperceived threat. But the anxiety, the distress is just as big. And the neutralizing behaviors don't change. Y'all are still freezing and hiding and screaming and running and possibly peeing your pants for a teddy bear. This is the essence of a false alarm. A false alarm is at the core of OCD and anxiety disorders. In fact, I find it really helpful to zoom out and pay attention to how many disorders have a false alarm at the core. The core of each of these is that busted alarm, the alarm that's going off when it doesn't need to, sending the grizzly bear signal when there is no grizzly bear. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, false alarm at the core. Body dysmorphic disorder also has a false alarm at the core. Social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, specific phobias, even PTSD and acute stress disorder. All of these have this in common, a false alarm at the core. And that is so helpful in being able to effectively conceptualize these cases, not only for you as the therapist, but also for the clients that you work with. And we do really great collaborative care. We want to conceptualize the case together with our clients. This lens is so valuable, that lens of the false alarm. It's also incredibly valuable when working with family and support systems, which we know is so valuable in so many cases. Being able to explain this through that lens of a false alarm can really help everyone connect and understand what is happening in a very empathetic way. So, does anybody have questions so far before I make everything more complicated?
It looks like Lauren dropped a question in the chat. She's curious about the training. At the core, she says, at the core, the thing that anxiety and OCD is present about is also a possibility, such as alarm that kiddos is in danger, even though he isn't at the time.
So I think the question is asking, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think this question is asking, what about when the threat is totally like real and possible? What about when it's not a teddy bear, but it's something genuinely scary, genuinely dangerous? Absolutely, right? PTSD is my favorite example of this, in fact. With PTSD, not only is there like a credible threat, the thing they're afraid of is real, it happened, right? There was a situation where the bad thing happened, the dangerous thing happened. But the thing about PTSD is maybe there was a bear, right? Maybe there really was a bear, but the P in PTSD stands for post traumatic stress disorder, meaning after the traumatic event. You are no longer in that traumatic, dangerous situation, and yet the alarm is still going off. So that false alarm can absolutely occur for something that seems so legitimately dangerous, that could be dangerous and important, but it is not actually dangerous in that moment. You're still misperceiving a threat in that moment. I think PTSD is a perfect example. Any other questions? This is a two-part training to make sure that we had time to answer questions as we went. So I'm just going to keep piling on layers, making things more complicated because that's fun for everyone, right? Okay. I mentioned at the beginning today that we are going to zoom in on these two specific diagnoses that have a false alarm at the core. The reason I picked these two is number one, it's in our name, right? We're big enthusiasts about treating obsessive compulsive disorder at OCD anxiety centers. It's literally in our name, it's our jam. Um, this, I think, is so important to talk about because there's so many easy misconceptions out there. It's really easy to mess this up with the best of intentions. It can be tricky. So it's worth getting clarity here and being really thoughtful about differential diagnosis. And we also wanted to zoom in on generalized anxiety disorder because this is another one that is so commonly misunderstood and misdiagnosed and mistreated. And we've been working with GAD for years now, and we have found how effective the treatment can be when it's done well through this lens, when you really do it right. Oftentimes, these clients with generalized anxiety disorder are suffering so much. They've been through 8 different therapists, they've tried so many different things, and they are often the most severe clients that we see. People often think, oh, OCD, this is going to be like really scary and severe. But honestly, more often it's our GAD clients that are more likely to be housebound. And so it's really important to be able to identify these clearly and get them to the appropriate treatment that's going to work for them, that's going to set them up for success. So let's start by zooming in on OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. I love hallmark features. I always tell this story because it's so sad. I love the DSM, like to like a weird degree. I love the DSM. I collect historic DSMs behind me. There's a shelf that's just like a timeline of DSMs through history. I know I'm that level of nerd. It's fine. When I was a teenager, I read the DSM and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so ready. Like, I'm so ahead of the game. And I got to college a few years later and discovered that no, I read the wrong DSM because there were like different versions of this. I read the DSM 3, which is quite old at this point. So that was relatively useless. Then I got to college and it was the DSM 4 TR. And I really enjoyed diving into that. And I memorized the whole thing in grad school. And then I graduated in 2015 with my doctorate. Do you know what happened in 2015? A new DSM came out. And so I had a brand new one. And that's the one I had to use to do my licensure exam. So I'm 3 DSMs deep at this point, and then we got a new 5. Anyway, the DSM is great, and the criteria is a lot. And if you are trying to really memorize this enough to be able to screen for things effectively, efficiently, with real human beings in your office, you're going to feel silly again and again because you keep getting a new book with slightly different criteria. So, because of all of that, I have found in practice that paying attention to these hallmark features is very, very helpful. When we're doing good differential diagnosis, hallmark features is often the thing that helps us distinguish between disorders that have some overlap that feel really similar. Hallmark features of OCD are so beautifully straightforward. We are looking for obsessions and compulsions. And although that's so beautifully straightforward, it can get a little bit tricky because people use the word obsessions very differently out in the real world than we do in practice. Out in the world, I'm going to say I am so obsessed with puppies. Obsessed. I love puppies so much. When I got on this call today, I immediately asked Julie where her puppy was. But that's not what we mean when we talk about obsessions in OCD. When we talk about obsessions in OCD, we are talking specifically about intrusive thoughts. Things not that you love, that you think about all the time because you love them, not things that you've got a fixation about, but instead these scary, disturbing, intrusive thoughts, thoughts you don't want to be having that come into your brain uninvited, unwanted, that are scary, disturbing, and very much counter to who you are as a person. So that's the first thing to understand. The next word, compulsions, is a bit more straightforward, but again, it's important to remember that compulsions does not mean something that makes you feel better. I know that DSM says this still. I will die on this hill. I have worked with so many OCD clients over the years. I have spent so much time with them. It is crystal clear to me when someone does a compulsion, most of the time they don't feel better, not even temporarily. Most of the time, a compulsion makes someone's anxiety go up, not down. So, why do they keep doing it then? Remember, a compulsion is just another word for neutralizing behavior. Any behavior that tries to neutralize a perceived threat. And every time we do a neutralizing behavior, what do we learn? We learn the threat is real, tightening the alarm. That's why people with OCD keep doing the compulsions, not because it feels good, not because it makes their anxiety go down. They keep doing the compulsions because the alarm keeps going off, because their brain has learned this thing is dangerous. It's a bear that's going to eat your face. You better do something. So with OCD, the hallmark features we're looking for are obsessions and compulsions. Any questions so far? Sometimes I rock the boat with that a little bit. Ooh, that's a good one. I saw one in the chat this time. I'm struggling over here with the chat. Sam asks, can you talk about pure O, OCD? I can, but I'm going to be slightly controversial. This is another hill I'm going to die on. The idea of pure O, this idea has been around for many, many years, and it's pretty controversial in our little OCD community. Because the idea of pure O is the idea that there are some people with OCD that don't have compulsions, that just have obsessions. The hill I'm going to die on is no, they don't. People with OCD absolutely have both obsessions and compulsions. And oftentimes, what is referred to as pure O is actually someone that's experiencing mental compulsions rather than just obsessions. There's still that neutralizing behavior that's happening, but it's incredibly covert and a mental compulsion. So something like trying to cancel out a scary thought, something like trying to figure something out to find a special kind of certainty that OCD often demands, or reviewing things over and over again. These are all mental compulsions, mental neutralizing behaviors. And oftentimes those cases can be tagged as pure O. And I tend to think that does our clients a disservice because they are typically, whoa, I'm going to mute people. Thanks. They are typically mental compulsions. Other questions so far?
There's, oh, so you see that, Kate? There's one in the chat says, how do you figure out someone has relationship OCD versus problem in the relationship that makes them anxious?
That is a great question and can easily become a trap for both clients and therapists. This idea of figuring out, right? OCD often demands this special magical certainty that really truly doesn't exist. And so it's easy to get caught in a trap of figuring out, right? But how do I figure it out for sure? If someone is trying to figure it out for sure, that is a red flag right there for OCD. But the most helpful thing that you can do to reasonably find out if this is more likely relationship themed OCD or if it's just relationship issues that naturally make somebody uneasy and anxious. The best thing that you can do is honestly put it in the cycle. Use that false alarm cycle to see, does this fit with OCD or not? And that's a really important first step when conceptualizing something like OCD. Be able to map out that false alarm and don't force something into the false alarm just because we kind of want it to be OCD. Be open to the possibility that it's not. And there's one more question. Oh, yes. Emily says, can you flesh out the difference between someone with OCD with mental compulsions versus someone with GAD? Girl, yes. Pretty much our second half, part 2, is mostly that because that can get really, really tricky. We also have one more that says, when you were using the grizzly bear as the example of the trigger in PTSD, it would be a traumatic event. What would that be in anxiety and OCD? So the trigger wouldn't necessarily be the traumatic event in PTSD. Actually, the trigger could be anything. Because remember, this is post trauma. And so this alarm happens in a moment post trauma. So the trigger could be a sound, a smell, or an intrusive thought, a memory, an intrusive memory about the event. But the trigger itself is not the event in PTSD. And it can really be anything, especially in OCD. I would say the trigger is pretty limitless. And just when you think you've seen it all, you're wrong. It gets very, very creative. And the trigger can be absolutely anything. I think it's really helpful to take a look at this next diagram. So we've got our basic false alarm, right? And you see that highlighted here in yellow. This diagram shows us specifically the cycle of OCD. You can see the false alarm is at the core. We've got trigger, perceived threat, anxiety, distress, urge to neutralize, neutralizing behaviors, also known as compulsions, and that critically important confirmation of threat. Every time we do a compulsion, we learn the threat must be real, tightening the alarm. But with OCD, you'll notice the trigger has this like ghosty dotted line. And there's a new element here, intrusive thoughts, also known as obsessions. And so in OCD, there can be a trigger, but it's kind of not required. Meaning a rogue intrusive thought can come out of nowhere for no good reason and launch this cycle. Am I still sharing my screen? I can't even tell anymore. No, that was weird. Okay, let's do it again. A ghost. Okay, now yes? That was so weird. Glad I noticed that. Okay. Y'all let me know if that happens again. We got a ghost. Okay, is everybody with me so far? Julio? Hey. I mentioned before, obsessions here mean intrusive thoughts. It's important to remember we all experience intrusive thoughts to some extent, right? During this training, you've had some rogue thought enter your mind. And it's not necessarily a thought you're trying to have. However, when we talk about these intrusive thoughts with OCD, it's important to remember that when you have an intrusive thought, it probably comes in, you're like, oh, that was a weird thing that just happened, and then it goes on its way. With OCD, these intrusive thoughts are sticky. They don't just mosey on their way. They kind of get stuck. They're experienced as distressing, scary. These can often be really vivid, graphic, very disturbing thoughts. And they're sticky. People with OCD often feel like, oh my gosh, this must mean something about me. And this experience can very easily trigger that anxiety alarm. But it's just a thought. It's not a grizzly bear. And yet our grizzly bear alarm is going off. So our entire OCD cycle can be triggered just with the intrusive thought. It can also be triggered by something more concrete, something like a certain situation, an image on a billboard, a song, something that comes up in conversation. OCD is so limitless in this way. I think it's really important to remember that OCD has this limitless perceived threat. A lot of the other disorders that we often talk about, especially anxiety disorders, there's a more specific, narrow perceived threat, right? Social anxiety disorder, for example, fear of negative evaluation from others. Wrap it up. Panic disorder, fear of panic attacks. Wrap it up. These are really narrow and specific. But with OCD, that perceived threat can be anything. And it's especially important to remember that because oftentimes media portrayal of OCD keeps it in a pretty narrow box, right? I'm afraid of germs. I'm afraid of things being disorganized. And although that can be a part of OCD, it's really not the most typical. One of the most typical things that people are afraid of is fear of imperfection, fear of failure. These are more commonly the perceived threats that we see in OCD. We also see a fear of harming yourself, a fear of harming others, a fear of being a pedophile is so much more common than people think. Part of the reason why this is such a limitless threat is because OCD is really good at tying itself to what is most important to someone. It will always go after whatever is most important to that person, seeing it as low-hanging fruit it can attach to. OCD is a really interesting beast in that way, and it'll shift and change over time. So I do think it is helpful, especially when you're trying to do this in real life with a real human being in the room, often under some time pressure. It's really helpful to be familiar with some common obsessional domains, things like fear of harming self. What if I kill myself? That's way more common than people often think. Fear of harming others. What if I'm actually secretly a serial killer? That's a scary thought people have a lot. Contamination concerns. What if I get sick and die? Emotional contamination. This one's so fascinating to watch. Things like, what if I become stupid? What if something about me changes? What if I get that person's essence on me and it does something to me? This idea of emotional contamination. What if I can take on their emotions? What if they're going to take on my emotions and I cause someone to kill themselves? Cannot tell you how many times I've heard these things from our OCD clients. Sexual obsessions are incredibly common. Things like, what if I'm a pedophile? What if I actually want to hurt children? Religious scrupulosity. I'm out here in Utah, a religious hub. I've bounced around to different religious hubs throughout my career, and in any religious hub, we see a spike in religious scrupulosity, which is the fear of breaking religious rules. And because OCD will always grab on to what is most important to someone, we often see that spike in a religious hub where religion is often especially important to people. Symmetry or exactness, this obsessional domain often looks like things needing to feel just right. Maybe things need to feel even, but sometimes it's less obvious than that. And sometimes that yardstick moves. Sometimes it's as simple as this just needs to feel right. But what does right mean? Well, in this moment, this is what right means, but 3 seconds from now, right might mean something different. And so this is something we often do see in OCD. We also sometimes, but honestly less often, see superstitious obsessional domain, which is, the classic things like I can't do anything with the number 13 or everyone will die. This is often tied to some nice magical thinking, but comes up way less often than some of the other ones that I've talked about. We can also have some health-related or somatic themes that come up. What if I actually have cancer? What if I have some sort of really scary disease I don't know about? I need to find out, and I need to be sure. That special magical certainty that OCD often demands. We can also sometimes see a hoarding or saving flavor to OCD, but it's important to remember that hoarding disorder is its own distinct diagnosis at this point. And so we want to be cautious to not mix those up, because hoarding disorder is treated very differently than some hoarding themes within OCD. And again, looking at that false alarm cycle is going to be really helpful in distinguishing those. We can also see themes like sensory motor things, which is often the fear that something that happens automatically will stop happening automatically. Like, what if I lose the ability to swallow? What if I just forget how to swallow and I die? This would be an example of a sensory motor obsessional domain. And finally, we've got sticky thoughts. This is the one I've seen most often throughout my career in this realm is, what if this song never gets out of my head? We've all had a song stuck in our head, and it was annoying and maybe frustrating, but probably not grizzly bear terrifying. But someone with OCD might feel like, I have this song stuck in my head and it's going to be stuck in my head for the rest of my life, and that's horrifying. I'm going to pause here for just a moment and remind everyone it's really helpful to be familiar with these very common obsessional domains, right? These are things you want to look for. And also, when you hear them, don't be weird. Don't freak out. These are very common in OCD. And so having this list is really going to help you create a nice safe space for someone that's been brave enough to tell you what their scary thoughts look like. And it's important to remember that I said the perceived threat is limitless. These are really common ones, but it is just a small sample of what's out there. Just because someone's fear does not fall into this realm, it's still OCD. I have had clients come up with incredibly brilliant and creative things to be afraid of. I've had clients that were afraid that gravity would stop working. I've had clients afraid that they would fall into another dimension and never be able to get out. And this was all OCD. So be familiar with these, but remember, there's plenty outside of this list as well that would still fall into the realm of OCD. I want to take a couple moments and walk through a few examples. I want to make sure that we get these examples in today because it really walks you through what this can look like, what the false alarm might look like in someone with OCD. Super common one is in this scenario, our trigger, there is a trigger, driving a car. What a completely normal thing we do. Many of us probably did this today. Driving a car is a trigger. And all of a sudden, we've got this intrusive thought while driving the car. And the intrusive thought is, what if I hit someone with my car? And the brain interprets something terrible is happening, right? Those intrusive thoughts in OCD are scary, sticky, disturbing. And so they're interpreted as threat. Something terrible is happening, and so our sympathetic nervous system clicks on, dumping cortisol and adrenaline into our body. We feel the feels. Grizzly bear alarm is going off. Nothing else is happening. You're literally just driving your car down the road. Boop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop. I've had a scary thought. Literally nothing is happening. Just had a scary thought, and the grizzly bear alarm is going off. And when our grizzly bear alarm goes off, we feel that urge to neutralize the threat. And so this person with OCD is going to engage in a neutralizing behavior, something to try to neutralize the threat. They're going to check to see if someone is hurt on the side of the road, right? They had this terrifying thought, what if I hit somebody with my car? And so they're pulling over and they're checking to make sure that they didn't. But when they do that neutralizing behavior, they learn this is dangerous. They confirm that driving is dangerous. That's what their brain is learning in the background. And the alarm gets tighter. So now they get back in the car, they start driving again. That compulsion, that neutralizing behavior didn't make them feel better. It didn't give them that certainty that OCD demands. And so more quickly now, because we've got a tighter alarm, the thought comes back. What if I hit somebody with my car? What if I hit somebody with my car and I didn't notice because they were actually in the bushes? And they go back again. They get out of the car. Now they have to check the bushes. I've had clients do this for hours, never getting to where they actually were trying to go in their car. This is a shockingly common example of OCD. But OCD can also look like triggers just making dinner, right? Again, completely normal activity, everyday activity. I'm just making dinner. While I'm making dinner, all of a sudden, for no good reason, this intrusive thought, this obsession pops into my mind. What if I actually want to hurt them because I'm really a serial killer? Here I am, chopping vegetables, getting dinner ready for the family I love very, very much. What if I'm actually a serial killer and I want to hurt them? And the brain says something terrible is happening and the alarm goes off, the grizzly bear alarm. And so now, remember that pure O question was such a great question. Now I'm going to do some mental compulsions. These can be really covert. Now I'm mentally reviewing times when I felt angry and trying to remember if I wanted to hurt someone. And I'm deep into this mental compulsion. Nobody else can maybe see what's happening, but I am tormented trying to figure out if I'm actually a serial killer when all I was doing was making dinner for my family. And because I engaged with that neutralizing behavior, I've confirmed that being around sharp objects must be dangerous. Now I might not make dinner anymore. Maybe I might pick a dinner that requires no cutting of vegetables. So I won't let myself near knives anymore. The compulsion in the moment was completely mental. Let's look at one more. Making decisions is our trigger here. Tiny decisions we have to make all the time. This is where OCD starts looking really similar to GAD, and it gets really tricky to pull them apart. Making little decisions. All of a sudden, the intrusive thought comes into my mind. If I make a mistake, then catastrophic things will start happening. Something terrible is happening. The grizzly bear alarm is going off. And what do? I'm going to again engage in those mental compulsions to consider every possible scenario and outcome before making a decision. Y'all, I have seen clients frozen in the grocery store, deciding between two different cereals, trapped in this loop. If I make a mistake, something horrible is going to happen. I have to consider every possible scenario, and they look frozen in the grocery store, staring at the cereals. This can often be linked to some of that magical thinking as well, right? Almost like a butterfly effect kind of a thought, that the wrong cereal is going to create this domino effect that ends the world. And it feels very, very high stakes. But again, engaging in the neutralizing behavior, engaging in the compulsion, considering every possible option, being super, super careful, has taught me that making decisions is dangerous, making it way more likely the next time I'm making decisions, the alarm will go off. All of these are examples of OCD, but they're so different than what the media often portrays as OCD. And they're often really different from what we can overtly see as OCD, right? This isn't someone checking, flipping light switches, washing their hands. So much of this is happening silently in their head. And so it's really, really helpful to map out the false alarm for someone. If you've got someone that comes in with high anxiety, start thinking through the lens of a false alarm. And mapping it out like this is really going to help you catch some of those more subtle, covert mental compulsions that a client might otherwise not report, but are very, very common and very important, and can often masquerade as generalized anxiety disorder. I'm going to pause there because I know we have like 5 minutes left. Part 2, we will dive more specifically into generalized anxiety disorder and then pit it directly against OCD to see what exactly are we looking for to be able to tell the difference when these get very Venn diagram overlapped. So this is my plug to get you to come to part 2 in a couple of weeks, and I hope to see you there. But I'm going to take the last couple minutes to try to answer questions that have come up so far, so we can go into part 2 feeling really confident. What questions do we have?
Yeah, it looks like we did have a few questions come in. I know Sabrina had asked what the difference was between OCD with medical sickness concerns and illness anxiety disorder.
Ooh, that can be so difficult and tangled, right? Just because someone has OCD doesn't mean they're not sick, right? Someone can absolutely have true chronic illness and OCD. And this is why I always say the critical component to case conceptualization is being able to map out that alarm cycle. Because anxiety isn't just a false alarm. Anxiety also happens for a real danger. We don't want to teach people to ignore those. We want to teach them to distinguish between real danger and a false alarm so that they can apply the elements of treatment to the false alarm while still validating things that are real. And oftentimes that is illness. There are plenty of people that have illness, that are anxious about their illness. The question is, when does it become a false alarm? That grizzly bear alarm going off in the absence of real danger. And you can map out that alarm moment to moment. And that's really, really important, especially when it comes to illness anxiety. These are often people that the medical field has failed horribly, right? Someone with chronic illness has often been told they're crazy by medical providers over the years. That doesn't mean they don't have illness anxiety. It doesn't mean they don't have OCD. It means that we also need to listen to our clients and teach them how to map out their own false alarm rather than us always just trying to be able to tell with magic. Do we have time for one more question, Joseph?
Sure, let's do it. I know someone had asked, would a mental compulsion include reviewing the entire day to make sure they didn't do something wrong?
Yes.
Or maybe that they didn't miss something either.
Yes. Short answer, yes. Great job. Let's do another one.
Yeah, someone else looks like Brittany had asked, how do you differentiate between OCD and OCPD?
Ooh, that one comes up a lot. It's actually very important to differentiate here. OCD versus OCPD, these are super, super different diagnoses. Someone with OCD often is aware that what they're doing doesn't make sense. It's just that their alarm is so loud that wins. Someone with OCPD typically believes that what they're doing does make sense. And you're the one that's stupid and reckless. That's often the biggest distinguishing factor. But I think it's also important to recognize that with OCPD, if you really look at the diagnostic criteria, you're looking for a very different flavor than, say, obsessions and compulsions. It's really more of a personality disorder that can have a false alarm kind of built into it. But the false alarm isn't the absolute core of that diagnosis, although it is present. Oh, it's 1:00. Okay, if you still have questions, write them down and bring them to part 2. And part 2 is going to be so much fun. And I hope you don't miss it.
Thank you so much, Kate. This has been so amazing, this presentation. And yes, we're looking forward to part 2. If you would like to join us for part 2 and you've already attended part 1, we're going to use the same Zoom link. So you're already registered for part 2. I'm going to send out emails in the meantime anyway, just to remind everyone. But if you attended, you registered for part 1, you're automatically registered for part 2. So we'll convene again on the 25th. So we'll see you in 2 weeks, everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
all so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Juliana. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.